We welcome you to this discussion about the book of Isaiah. We're going to be talking about chapters 9, 10, and 11 today. With me I have three distinguished colleagues from Brigham Young University. Terry Szink, who is on our faculty here and has been a specialist in Middle Eastern studies, and Madsen, a very popular and dynamic teacher, especially with the writings of Isaiah, and Ray Huntington, one of our great quiet scholars of the Scriptures. I appreciate you taking time out to be with us here today. Well, today, for this particular session here, we're scheduled to handle chapters 9, 10, and 11 of Isaiah, which are also part, kind of right in the middle of this big block of Isaiah chapters in 2nd Nephi, chapters 19, 20, and 21. Ray, why don't you get us started here and help us understand the context and importance of these chapters?
Isaiah has to be understood with some historical background, and it can't escape it. It's important. What's going on in these chapters 9, 10, and 11 is Assyria, which is now the predominant bully in the region, is threatening and will, in fact, invade Syria and Israel and ultimately destroy Israel, take them into captivity. And then will threaten Judah and will, in fact, invade Judah. The king of Judah, Ahaz, as we talked about in chapter 7 and 8, is not going to trust in God and in God's protective power, but instead is going to trust in the arm of flesh, and is going to trust in the king of Assyria to, in a sense, protect and save. And so Isaiah in chapters 9 and 10 and 11 really wants to talk about kings. Who are the kings that can really save? Is it the king of Assyria? Not for Isaiah.
And it's definitely not the king of Judah.
It's not the king of Judah. But he's going to introduce in chapter 9 one of the wonderful, wonderful prophecies about the great king, the king of kings.
Now that's a nice overview of the historical setting there. Again, we need to keep two names separate, Assyria and Syria. They're not the same.
That's
it's
correct.
not just that we've kind of dropped a syllable
Right.
there. But, so Assyria is the big dominant power on the
That's
eastern
right.
end of the Fertile Crescent, moving westward into these nations. And Syria, which is basically the same region as the modern country of Syria, is an eminent target there. Now, there's also some imagery here, though, of some tribal lands of Israel and darkness. What's some of the symbolism here? What do we have here, Ann?
This is really interesting. I think it took me many readings of Isaiah to start this chapter one day and say to myself, my goodness, it's talking about Zebulun and Naphtali. And I looked on my map, which all of you can do, and there it is. It's up there. It's in the Galilee. It's near Nazareth. And suddenly, like so many times in Isaiah, you find him talking messianically even before you realize it. I mean, later on in this chapter, it's very obvious. We hear the music behind the words from Handel. But at the very beginning, could I read some of that?
Please.
I love the way that, nevertheless, the dimness in the chapter before, and we said last time, I think, not to regard chapter breaks because it was written all in a piece. And so the end of chapter 8 says, and they shall look unto the earth and behold trouble and darkness, dimness of anguish, and they shall be driven to darkness. Nevertheless, it says, the dimness shall not be such as was in her vexation, when at the first he lightly afflicted the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and afterward did more grievously afflict her by the way of the sea beyond Jordan, in Galilee of the nations. And then begins, the people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. They that dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them hath the light shined. Oh, I adore that. I mean, this is part of Isaiah that is so beautiful.
A lot of this darkness and gloom and political turmoil and attack, there is hope, there is light that is there.
And the metaphor of light and darkness is so easy to take hold of. I mean, you just need to close your eyes wherever you're reading and think about, or be in a dark room that doesn't have a window and turn on one light and see how it disseminates itself.
Now, Ray, you talked about, he's talking about kings here, but wait a minute, it seems to me he's talking about babies, not
Yes.
kings here. Verse 6.
6.
Terry, could you read that verse for us, please?
Sure. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace.
Thank you. As we were meeting shortly here before this session, I wanted to ask one of us to sing it, but we thought maybe that might to end this programming forever on these roundtable discussions.
It would be censored.
But you can't read it without just having the melody echo, can you? A child is born, government upon his shoulders, name shall be called. Actually, in the Hebrew there, it's 4 little couplets.
That's right.
A noun followed by a modifier. So actually in the Hebrew, it's a counselor wonderful, a God mighty, a Father everlasting, a Prince peaceful. And so we've got 4 titles here. Let's just quickly talk about each one of them. Just how is God, or Jehovah, the Lord, Jesus Christ, a counselor?
This title, Counselor Wonderful, as I read it, one of the things that comes to my mind is an advocate. Someone who is going to plead your cause.
So you're thinking of it like a legal term, like a counselor at your side.
It can be looked at too as somebody who gives counsel. But in this case, I like to think of it more in this legal setting, that here is somebody who will protect you, who will look after your rights, and he will get you all that he can get you as far as he can under the law as your advocate.
That's beautiful.
That is beautiful.
So he's not only a wonderful counselor, but he's a mighty God. I mean, the scriptures are replete with examples from the creation to the miracles with Moses in the wilderness, and there's going to be some later miracles Isaiah's going to record. I mean, he is a God of might, and we see this again in the New Testament, and we know this will be part of the second coming. But this third term, an everlasting Father, we usually think of him as a brother type or as a son type, but here's another male role in the family, but he's actually a father type. How is he a father type?
As we take his name upon us, we become his children, and we see him in that way, in much the same way that you were talking about, a father who looks after and defends his family.
Yeah, it's so interesting. King Benjamin in the Book of Mormon talks about when we make because of the covenant we've made, we become his sons and daughters. And I think, in my mind, the covenant that they're making is baptism. And one of the symbolism of baptism is birth. And when you are born, you take upon yourself the name of your parents. So when we are reborn, we take upon ourselves the name of our Father, in this case, Jesus Christ.
Excellent, excellent. And of course, it can also, the term father can mean head or originator of something, like the father of the gospel and the father of resurrection and salvation. I mean, you could just give some wonderful discourses on that. And then as a Prince of Peace, of course, as he tells us, not as the world might give it, but a special kind of peace that he brings. I mean, you could just take that one little verse and you could give 4 or 5 people an assignment to speak in sacrament meeting on just one phrase in there, and none of them would have enough time to do it. And that's just the way Isaiah is. He's just so compact and so profound that once you stop and take a little bit of time and start to ponder it, it just opens up with so much possible meaning.
And the wonderful thing is that no two would give the same talk. And that's the way it is in Isaiah. You read it, you don't need to be worried that you've got the right answer. Students often say, I don't know if this is right. And I always say, stop, don't say that. If it's an idea that you've received, that's what metaphors are for, to help you open up an idea that's what these metaphors do for us and have just done as we've talked about them.
Let's talk about the very last metaphor of chapter 9 here, and we've talked about this earlier, but I think this is an appropriate time to discuss it maybe in a little more detail. In spite of all the things happening around them, and much of it negative and some of it prophetic positive, his arm is stretched out still. What does it mean when his hand or his arm is outstretched still? Is this good or bad? Should we?
Well, traditionally, scholars, when they've looked at this, they've seen, well, his anger is not turned away, his hand is stretched out still, and it goes on with traditional types of more destruction, and he's still mad, and he's still going to destroy. And it's certainly possible to read it that way. However, especially from the Book of Mormon, we learn the insight that stretched out hand may also be interpreted as a hand willing to help us, willing to take us back, willing to forgive us when we've made mistakes.
So it's not a hand like with a bludgeon, but it's a hand maybe to help pull us out of this mire or this situation, whatever.
Well, even Isaiah himself later will say, "Is my arm too short to help you?" I see it kind of both hands, maybe the Christus, you know. The one hand is saying, I am a just God. You are going to have to meet my standard, not my standard, but the standard, or the consequences will follow. But I've got my hand, and I say, come to me with this hand. And it's always outstretched. And it reminds me of the Sistine Chapel, where the two hands don't quite touch. Well, we're the ones that have to stretch the last little bit. He's always there for us.
Now this imagery carries over here into the next chapter where the Lord talks about the strength of his hand compared to what Assyria and others might consider the strength of their hands or their power. Ray, you mentioned earlier about Assyria as a dominant power here. And boy, Isaiah calls her in verse 5 here, the rod of mine anger, the staff in their hand is my indignation. It sounds like Assyria is almost like this bludgeon in his hand here that he's using to try to humble Israel.
Absolutely. It's the same imagery as the Book of Mormon, where the Lord says, when the Nephites get out of hand, I'll humble them with the Lamanites. And when Israel and Judah, his covenant people, get out of hand, he's going to lower the hammer on them. And that hammer right now is Assyria and soon to be Babylon. And he'll use them and allow them to be used for that purpose.
And they certainly were probably one of the great, terrible nations of the Near East. They are very famous. There's artistic representations of how they treated their victims, and they didn't mess around.
They were barbarians. They were.
They were. When they talk about skinning alive and brutal torture, I mean, the Assyrians were notorious for intimidation.
Yeah, they could win a battle by just saying they were on their way.
Yes.
And nobody wanted to meet them. I think, though, the interesting thing here, too, is that they're doing this unknowingly.
That's a good point.
And he has all of these metaphors that say, you think that you're doing it for yourself. He's erasing the borders of nations. He's doing all these things. But he's not. He really is the rod in the hand of God.
Now, also in this chapter, we have him prophesying an army coming from the north, like starting here in verse 28. And here's where I guess, unless you really know your Israel's geography, you won't recognize most of these names, but he basically is describing communities and places coming right from the north. It would be like if somebody wanted to attack the Provo campus, he uses places like, Preston and Cache Valley and Brigham City and Salt Lake and Lehi and Orem, and you just get this impending doom. He's just right out the edge of campus there, and what are we doing here? He's just right here, this impending prophetic doom. But we understand, and we talked about this in an earlier series, Isaiah is not just talking about his time. It could be a Roman army coming into Jerusalem to conquer it and destroy it, like the Romans did at the end of the New Testament period. It could be a great army of Armageddon that we know will be in the second coming that will be coming here. But what's happening here is, as Israel and then Judah are being attacked, Israel is starting to scatter. So this is the first group of Israelites, the 10 tribes that start to scatter among the nations. Later, the Lehi community, the Mulekites, the Jews, and others will start to scatter. So this is it right here, and this is the instrument by which it's going to come, is this horrendous scattering. And as he finishes it, it appears the whole landscape has been cut down like a forest. It's just all these empty, barren stumps that are out there. And so I guess all is lost.
Not yet.
Help us out here, Terry.
Yeah, when chapter 7 begins, everything's been wiped out.
You mean 11?
When chapter 10 ends and 11 begins, you have a very famous passage. There shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse. In other words, the stem of Jesse is the trees that have been obliterated. There's nothing but a stump left, and yet a fresh green little rod is going to come forth that has life to it, and it will. It says, "And a branch shall grow out of his roots." In other words, something good is going to come out of this, and that's something that we know to be Jesus Christ. That is a prophecy, an answer to this question given to Joseph Smith, that the rod of Jesse, this branch would come out, would be Christ, and that he would we read on verse 2, "The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord." So all is not lost.
And
Now go ahead, Ann.
I was just going to say, you probably, you at home want to make a quick note of looking at D&C 113, where some of this is interpreted for you to look at and is very helpful in reading this.
Well, in fact, the importance of this chapter is it's in all of the major standard works of the Scripture.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, it's in the Bible. It's in 2 Nephi 21. You mentioned there are 3, and we'll talk about these 3 key terms that are a part of a question and answer section of the Doctrine and Covenants, section 113. But it's also referenced specifically in the Joseph Smith history in the Pearl of Great Price, where the angel Moroni quotes this chapter and tells Joseph Smith, this is about to be fulfilled. So if we wanted to go back and look in the time of Isaiah for its fulfillment, no, not yet. In the first coming of the Savior, in preparation for his ministry then, no, not yet. This is really one that we can, with prophetic authority, say, as of 1823, it was not. And I would think 180 years later, it would be, but maybe yes, maybe not. So let's identify these 3 key terms that he talks about. 2 from the first verse, a rod out of the stem of Jesse. Those are both asked about in section 113. Then we'll come down to verse 10 about a root of Jesse. And so there's 3 different questions, 3 different answers recorded there in section 113. Right. Now, the stem of Jesse, we're told, represents Christ. I love Isaiah's prophetic imagery here. There shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse. But Joseph Smith in his prose explains this rod as a servant in the hands of Christ. So we have Isaiah's poetry, rod out of the stem of Jesse, and then Joseph Smith's prose, a servant in the hands of Christ. And of course, we can usually identify and relate a little bit easier to Joseph Smith's prose than to Isaiah's poetry. But if we can take a look at that poetry and try to say it in our own words, why that sometimes helps Isaiah become more clear for us. And as and Terry, you read some of these descriptions here of this rod in verses 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and 7. It describes what he starts to bring about, this mighty servant, again, section 113, this powerful servant in the hands of the Lord. But it all describes the Lord, because as we saw with chapter 10, Assyria was a tool in the hand of the Lord. This rod will be a tool, will be an instrument in the hand of the Lord. And so as you talk about what he does and his characteristics in verses 2 through 5, you're talking about the Lord. Right. He is the servant of all servants. He is the master of all masters.
And the pervasive message here too is God is saying to us, I'm in charge.
Yeah.
There can be a menacing nation like Assyria who thinks it's calling the shots, but not really. I'm working my plan the way it's going to be worked, and within that plan, my son will be born. I will have a servant that will come forth later at some point in time, whether it's Joseph Smith or someone else, but he'll be my servant, and his program is going to be worked irregardless of what's going on outside.
One of my favorite parts there is where it says, he shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither reprove after the hearing of his ears. You know, it's the Christ that we keep describing here, and he's all the way through Isaiah. He's there, all the kinds of, and his servant, the same, you know, in the image of him, doing the same thing.
Now, verses 6, 7, and 8 have inspired poets and psalmists and artists for millennia here already. Of all the prophecies and of the prophets in all of the scriptures from ancient times of Adam down to this dispensation, as they look to the last days, it's interesting to me that as they talk about the last days, most of their prophecies take us up to the millennium, rarely into the millennium. But here the curtain is opened. Anne, could you read these classic verses of 6 and 7 for us, please?
I would love to. The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and these are natural enemies. And the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and a calf and a young lion, all these natural enemies, and fatlings together, and a little child shall lead them. And the cow and the bear shall feed, their young ones shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. Can I read the next one too?
Please.
Okay. And because this image, I mean, if you can let this metaphor speak to you, if you can see your little baby that is just crawling, can't walk yet, the suckling child shall play on the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the cockatrice's den. And of course, these two are ugly, horrible-looking snakes.
And
gotta,
dangerous.
You've got to read verse
lethal.
9 too, because that's
Okay. We could keep doing this. They shall not hurt. This is what Isaiah does to you. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. This time we've got waters that are wonderful.
Isn't that a beautiful curtain that's opened up?
Yes.
Well, as we try to highlight these chapters, and especially this one, Terry, is there some hope and some message we can get out of Isaiah here?
Oh, I think it's a message of hope. He's gone through and he's talked about back here in chapter 9 about the destruction of Judah, the destruction of Israel, the menace of the Assyrians, and the Babylonians later on would come down, and yet this is how Isaiah is. On one hand, he talks about the terrible destruction that comes from disobedience, and on the other hand, there's always the hope. There's always the restoration. There's always the return, the gathering that takes place. And what I especially like about Isaiah is he has these very important and profound truths that he teaches, but he also teaches them in a way that's just it's artistic. It wasn't an accident that Handel chooses texts from these chapters for his oratorio Messiah. He understood that Isaiah was not only a prophet but a great artist. This is some of the most beautiful language that's ever been written, and you can even feel this language when you read it in the English, with a translation from the Hebrew. It's wonderful in Hebrew. It's wonderful in English. And there's just a power to it. It's just, well, the passage that Anne read, they're almost beyond description. It's just amazing.
No question. I mean, Isaiah is to Hebrew like Shakespeare is to English, like Goethe would be in German. It's just a masterpiece. And when we look at the messages here, this servant and the messianic expectations, and this root of verse 10 and the description of him, and especially as you look at the description in section 113, all you need to do is just have a brief biography of Joseph Smith and just go down the checklist. Yes, he did this. Yes, he had these keys. Yes, he had this priesthood. This is where he had these angels come to him in the Kirtland Temple. And yes, okay. So you can almost feel like instead of saying root of Jesse in verse 10, just put in Joseph Smith Jr. and then read there.
And you've got the ensign.
You got the ensign, missionary work, but notice what this is going to help bring about in verse 13. For the envy also of Ephraim shall depart, and the adversaries of Judah shall be cut off, but Ephraim shall not envy Judah, and Judah shall not vex Ephraim. Remember, these are the two dominant tribes that have just been at war with each other, and yet here Isaiah is already prophesying a time when they're going to come together, work in harmony. And we represent Ephraim. Of course, Judah is another part of the house of Israel. But you can't really bring them together without the love and blessings and the power of the priesthood and of the gospel. And somehow or another, these two great servants are going to help bring about political and spiritual conditions that will prepare the earth for its millennial reign. These are powerful words of Isaiah. Thank you for helping us try to understand them.
For more information on this program, visit our website at byubroadcasting.org.